Hello, everyone. Welcome to 1.5 Degrees, the podcast where together we explore the science, solutions, and stories involved in the fight against climate change. I'm your host, Heidi Pan, speaking with the professionals behind the latest research, policies, culture, and innovations shaping our response to global environmental challenges. For today's episode, we are joined by Jeremy Orr, who is the Director of Litigation and Advocacy Partnerships at Earthjustice, to discuss his work in environmental litigation, community organization and lawyering, and more. At Earthjustice, Jeremy helps Earthjustice's offices, programs, and departments build strategies to deeply engage and partner with communities and other stakeholders. Jeremy has previously served as a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council, where he focused on drinking and source water protection issues, and has served on the People's Climate Movement as the director of state programs, building and mobilizing coalitions across more than 20 states in pursuit of climate justice. Jeremy was also part of the inaugural cohort of the Obama Foundation Leaders USA program and was a 2022 Rappaport Center for Law and Policy Senior Fellow in residence at the Boston College Law School. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jeremy. It's such an honor.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what it is that you do today and what your job entails?
Yeah, sure thing. So as you mentioned, I serve as a director of litigation and advocacy partnerships at Earthjustice, which is a longstanding, environmental legal practice where we do public interest, like environmental law, representing clients throughout the country and around the world in some instances on an array of issues. And my role is strictly internally focused. So, as you mentioned, right, I have a background in lawyering and practicing law, but at Earthjustice, I took a step back from the practice of law and policy itself, and I train our internal staff on how to be better partners out in the community. Earthjustice has a great commitment to partnership. It's one of our core values, and we're an organization that's been willing to put our money where our mouth is, right? So we have a few different partnership programs. We have a tribal partnerships program, a community partnerships program, and then we have my team, which is the litigation and advocacy partnerships team. And my sole focus is to support our staff all over the country, and helping them build the competencies, the knowledge, the skills, and abilities to go out into the world, out into the community, and partner in a meaningful way, in a way that centers equity and justice in our litigation and in our policy advocacy.
So awesome. Thank you so much. And I mean, I guess in the lead up to that though, can you share us a little bit more about your personal journey and what inspired you to focus on environmental issues, particularly I think previously in the areas of water protection and climate justice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I born and raised in Detroit. Still live here now. And I think for me, my upbringing to what environmental injustice was, even though I didn't have a name for it back then, right? I know what it's like to live in a neighborhood that doesn't have green space, right, and doesn't have access to certain environmental and outdoor resources. I know what it's like to live in a home where the water has been shut off and not having access to drinking water or water to bathe or cook. So that's something that's always stuck with me. But it wasn't until I got into community organizing after college that I truly realized that the injustices that we were facing and that I had even experienced, myself growing up, had a name, and that name was environmental justice, right? Injustice and environmental racism. And it was in organizing that I, kind of first started exploring, what it would mean to organize communities to fight for a healthier, safer, cleaner environment for themselves, and what kind of skills and tools would these communities need to stand up for themselves. And there are a couple of things that stood out to me. The first was just the lack of diversity in the environmental space, right? So knowing that there was space for people that looked like me and came from my community to be able to have a seat at the table, right? Sometimes it meant having others who look like you have a seat at the table and open the door for you. And the other thing too, for me, I realized that environmental advocacy can be very complex, right? It's a lot of public health, a lot of science, a lot of data that just the average person, myself included, right, sometimes may not understand. And I knew that if I could build up my own skill set, particularly I chose law school, right? Build up my own skill set to be able to better understand laws and policies and take complex information and break it down so that just the average person on the street could use it to protect themselves and advocate for themselves. I knew that that's what I wanted to do. And so I decided after organizing that I wanted to go to law school, and not simply go to law school just to practice any kind of law, but I wanted to do environmental and civil rights law and work at this intersection of race and income and environmental decision making, and be in a position to work hand in hand with communities, as I have been doing over the years.
That part about accessibility is so important, but like I guess underlooked or not really the first thing people think of when it comes to environmental protection, but they're so interrelated. Yeah. In working on, focusing on community engagement, are there any like specific examples of like memorable community partnerships that you've been a part of that had a positive impact on environmental justice that you can share with us?
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, there have been, so many over the years, as I mentioned, I kind of had a lot of experiences from community organizing right out of college in my early 20s to now being a director of litigation at one of the foremost, if not the foremost, environmental organizations in the country, if not the world, right? And everything in between. And I think some of my most meaningful experiences come from, places that are near and dear to my own heart, right? And experiences that I've had. I think one is um, the work I was able to do around the Benton Harbor water crisis when I was still at NRDC, right? And filing the emergency petition that got the ball rolling to replace all the lead pipes, right, in this community that was being poisoned with lead, very similar to Flint. Had the opportunity to work on the Flint water crisis in a number of different capacities over the years. First as and in a capacity as an environmental justice attorney at Transnational Environmental Law Clinic in Detroit when the crisis first set in December 2015, right, when it was first declared, right, I had an opportunity to work with EPA and communities and connect EPA with communities to ensure that they had the resources necessary to protect themselves, right? And then again, joining in RDC and working as a member of the litigation advocacy team that was enforcing the lawsuit and settlement to replace all the pipes, as well as ensure that everybody had filters in the community and that there was public education and that the city and the state were on task to replace the pipes, right? Being a part of that work to see the actual tangible impact. I guess it's been cases like that and advocacy like that where you can look and say, we fixed, right? We fixed something, right? This water was not drinkable and now it is. And that stuff is just so important.
In your experience, like what is the role of legal advocacy in general in addressing environmental justice issues like water safety, equity, and protection?
Yeah, legal advocacy and environmental law is so important, right? It's not the only tool. Sometimes it's not even the best tool, right? But it's a tool to and use when we really need the force of the law, the force of the courts on our side to make decision making. Because so much of environmental law and policy and enforcement happens in an administrative way, right? Rulemaking and policies and things, right? Not always legislation, but however, those rules and policies are still enforceable, in court. And one of the roles of litigation and environmental advocacy is saying sometimes, hey, we've exhausted every other option. Let's take it to court, right? Or it's we can foresee these other options are not going to work on the front end, right? Let's take it to court. Or maybe litigation is the only thing that some corporations and some governments, state, local, or federal, understand, right? It's we can go through, kind of jump through hoops and other processes, but sometimes how some of the actors and players and decision makers are going to act, and you can say, hey, let's take it to court. The thing about litigation, right, is it's oftentimes long, drawn out, takes into account like a lot of history, a lot of facts, a lot of information and evidence and things of that sort, right? But oftentimes what happens is, these wins that we can get in court are wins that are going to stand and hold up, right? Right. And that's the thing that we think about. Sometimes we'll have rulemaking and administrative wins that can easily be overturned or appealed, or, the thing with court is once we get to that final decision, we have a court enforceable decision to act in a certain way as it relates to environmental decision making. And I think that's important in many instances.
Yeah, no, I was gonna ask about like I've taken some preliminary like civics courses and whatnot, and the whole just even beginning to learn about it, one of the first things I learned is just how long-winded the process can be. But I mean, yeah, to have those long-standing wins, that is definitely a distinction. Going back to the work that you did with the People's Climate Movement and building and mobilizing coalitions, that's also a huge, lengthy process. I mean, what are some, I guess, like challenges that you faced in uniting all sorts of diverse groups, and like maybe some lessons that you can share with listeners in terms of coalition building?
Yeah, sure thing. I know a lot of folks remember the People's Climate March some years ago, which was the largest march for climate justice in the world, right out of New York, and then it was followed up a couple years later by People's Climate Movement Day of Action, right? A day of action for climate jobs and justice. I think that was 2018, right, where we mobilized tens of thousands of people in their states, right, all over the country to have days of action and begin to push forward, climate justice focused policies at their state and local levels. And one of the things, as you mentioned, right, when you're bringing together a diverse body of people, right, from age to race to gender to experience, right, you have a lot of people who have diverging opinions. I think we may all want the same outcome, a clean, safe, healthy environment and climate, right, to combat climate change, right? But the thing is, how do we get there, right? And that sometimes is oftentimes is difficult, right? The how we get there. And one of the things that we try to focus on, especially when you think about organizing advocacy, when just there are diverging opinions, right? Always come back to this idea of what are our shared values, right? The reason we're in this space working together is because we have some level of shared values. We have some level of mutual shared interest, right? And that always needs to be centered and sometimes recentered when we kind of get too far apart from each other and fight and argue about how do we get here, right? The main thing is that we want to remember that, hey, we're on the same page, we're on the same team, we're not each other's enemy, right? And we may disagree on the nuances of things, but we can figure out ways to compromise and come together to keep moving our movement and agenda forward.
That's really great advice. Sometimes I find myself like, getting caught up in internet like conversations and debates and all sorts, and those are inevitable. But yeah, no, that's so true that we need to keep that in mind in this work for sure. Somewhat related to that, do you have any like favorite or least favorite aspects of what you do?
Yeah, I do. The favorite aspect of what I do, and it's always been my favorite aspect of work ever since I was in community organizing in my early 20s. It was really like being in relationship with communities, right? Like actually being on the ground in the communities, training leaders, developing leaders, organizing communities to advocate for themselves. Like I love that because that's where the change happens, right? And that's where the meaningful work happens. That's where the relationships are built. That's where the values come out, right? And so for me, the favorite part of my work over the years has always been just being in direct relationship with impacted communities and helping them reach their goals. I'd say the least favorite part about my current job now is, as I mentioned, my work is all internal focused. I don't do as much, litigation and policy work anymore. So I'm kind of 1 or 2 degrees removed from the communities that we work with and support. So while the staff that I work with, the attorneys and advocates that I support, they're in communities in direct relationship with their partners and clients. I'm not, right? So sometimes, I miss that part of the work where, I'm training our staff and our staff goes out and does the work with communities. So sometimes I do miss that piece of being able, right, to interact with communities on a regular, and I still do to some extent under some circumstances work with our partners, but generally much of my work is internal focus. But I'll say the trade-off for that is knowing that even though I'm not the person interacting with the communities doing the work, I am training and impacting all of the staff, all of our staff throughout the country who are doing this amazing work. So in the past, where it was just me, myself, working on this one issue, trying to figure out how to center equity and justice on this one thing, on this one case, on this one policy. Now, I'm at an organization with hundreds of people, right? 15 offices around the country where I can help others figure out how to do it. So the reach of that work is just so much more impactful.
Kind of like being like the what's the term, like the rock in a pond and like the ripple effect or whatnot. But yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, related to that, in terms of building capacity and, like skill building and like, helping attorneys and advocates build authentic and lasting relationships. Can you give us an example of like what that support looks like and how you train attorneys and advocates?
Yeah, sure thing. So, one of the things I did with my team justice was create a toolkit. We created what we call a partnership guide, and it ended up being about 40 pages of just information and knowledge and experiences of how do you go about building meaningful relationships? How do you go about maintaining relationships? How do you go about repairing relationships when there's harm caused with partners and communities? And how do you take relationships to the next level? And so part of that, a big part of my work was creating this toolkit, this partnership guide to help support our staff. So a lot of times it looks like pulling trainings right from this guide and going around the country training our staff. Other times it looks like helping our staff with strategic planning, right? If we're saying, hey, we want to diversify our partnerships on this team, we want to increase our partnerships. How do we do that, right? So it's sitting down with teams to plan. It's brainstorming with them. Sometimes it's conflict resolution, right? When we realize that we may be at odds with a partner on the direction of the work and need to recenter. Sometimes it's helping our team and saying, hey, like let's take a step back. Let's have a little bit of mediation and figure out how do we get back on the same page. So it looks like all of those different things, right? It's training, it's technical support, it's conflict resolution, it's brainstorming, right? It's really just showing up showing up for our staff, and essentially any way that they need that would help them build their own competencies and capacities.
That work is so crucial. Thank you for what you do. For listeners who may be attorneys and advocates themselves, or, they're just generally seeking green careers or wanting to make an impact in the environmental sector, are there like some examples of specific skills or approaches that you have particularly found valuable, maybe even from the toolkit?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say the first thing, which I pull from organizing, and I think it's been important in every aspect of my life. It's learning how to do and have meaningful one-on-one conversations and relationships with the people that you're trying to build relationship with, right? So I think it's important and it's a skill, and there's a way to do that without it feeling transactional, right? Without it feeling operational, where in a way that it feels natural. So I think one of the biggest skills organizers and attorneys and advocates can have is truly learning how to do meaningful one-on-ones for the purpose of building trust and relationships. That's like that will always be number one on my list because it's so important. Those relationships are the foundation of the work, right? And it's those relationships where you identify somebody's interests. It's those relationships where you identify somebody's values, right? And it's those relationships and where you identify ways to build trust to create meaningful relationships.
Definitely. And I mean, even in that, it just makes the work itself a lot more meaningful for sure. Yeah. Perspective, working in this field for some time, what are some of like the current most pressing, I guess, environmental or community challenges are faced by overburned communities? And I mean, what innovative solutions or approaches have you come across in your work that give you hope for the future?
Yeah, sure thing, right? I mean, it's as we talk about climate, right, and we talk about rain and things of that sort, right? What we're really talking about is the air we breathe and the water we drink, right? The two essential elements that sustain life, right, in our world. And I would say as it relates to air, right, one of the most pressing issues has to be air quality, right? I mean, we talk about, greenhouse gas and the climate changing and heating up and all the implications of that. And those are big challenges, but I always go back to just at the most basic level, how is that impacting people in the communities where they live? And particularly when I think about air quality, right? Clean air issues. What can we do? And what are those who are supposed to be protecting us, i.e. our government regulators doing to protect us, right? So I think that's one of the more pressing issues. And I think one of the other pressing issues is water quality, particularly lead in drinking water, as we've seen, right? The Flint water crisis really put this on the map. But lead in drinking water has been an issue in our country and around the world for centuries, right? And our country, right, since the 1800s, since communities started using lead pipes en masse, right, to build out communities and build out cities with that infrastructure. And I think the toxic water infrastructure that is throughout the country, and millions of lead pipes, right? Estimated maybe to see 10 million, right, lead pipes throughout the country are a major problem, right? Is a pressing issue. And one of the things, as I think about solutions, one of the things we've seen is the EPA recently announced a proposal for a new lead and copper rule that would mandate the replacement of all lead pipes within 10 years. That's huge, right? That's huge, right? Because that eradicates this toxic infrastructure that's torn apart communities for centuries, and gets quite literally gets lead out of our water, and I think that's so important.
Yeah, no, and to think like it's mind-boggling how this isn't talked about enough, and I think that legislation is definitely so important. Like to know that our infrastructure is still lead pipes carrying water, and yeah. Um, I mean, and so I guess like maybe looking ahead, what do you see as like the kind of future of environmental advocacy and in addressing global environmental challenges? And for those who want to like go into environmental litigation, what are some, I guess like advice that you could give to them?
Yeah, I think the future of environmental advocacy is shaping up right before us, right? I think we're seeing terms like environmental justice and climate justice, which never used to be used, now making it to the White House and making it to the halls of Congress, right? We have terminology that is mainstream and widespread, which means more people are thinking about it, more people are hearing about it, more people are learning about it, which is great for the environmental movement across the board, right? So I always say, right, I don't think there's any shortage of work to be done in our field, and we aren't solving the climate crisis anytime soon, right? So there's always going to be work to do around these issues of environmental advocacy. And for for people who are looking to get into that work, I think some of the best things you can do is connect locally, right? Connect with the local organizations, whether it's the Sierra Clubs or League of Conservation Voters or the Greenpeaces, right? Let alone the NRDC and Earthjustice, big organizations, but these organizations that have chapters and branches in your community, the NAACPs, right, and LULACs, who also are working on these environmental and climate justice issues. I think being able to connect on a local level and state level with the work that's going on in your community is so important, to help you get a better understanding of the work that you're interested in, the work that you're looking to do, and how you could use, whether it be that law degree or PhD or master's or policy or just even your bachelor's degree, right, to get into the field, right? I think just being able to use the education and skills that you have, if you're looking to work in that space as a professional, think it's important to connect locally first and learn about those issues and let those inform how you develop your strategies and your theology on how you want to impact the climate crisis.
I feel like in terms of our conversations about global environmental challenges and climate change, because it is a very much a global issue, I have heard a lot of people find that local issues get kind of lost in that. So thank you for highlighting. Could turn back time, but without the butterfly effects. Is there anything from, life and your work experience so far that you would tell your younger self?
Patience, right? I think that's the biggest thing for me, right? Realizing that change doesn't happen overnight, right? And I think I began to learn that in community organizing, which is a long process of really developing leaders over the course of years to advocate for themselves. And you may not see change for years. I remember there was an issue when I first started organizing, that I worked on, and yeah, organized for years and created the foundation for this particular body of work, and left. And um, it wasn't until I picked up a newspaper literally 7 or 8 years later and saw that this issue that we started working on had passed. It was to get Sunday transportation. The city that I was working in did not have Sunday transportation. Um, but just that, right? Just the idea that this stuff is long, and change is slow sometimes, but be patient. I think that's the thing for me, right? Because you're a young person yourself, right? And it feels like we've let people kick these issues down the road long enough. Like it's time for change. And I agree with that sense of urgency so much, right? But also realizing that, everything won't happen overnight. So patience is what I'd share with myself.
Yeah, that's definitely something I personally need to be reminded of sometimes, for sure. But yeah, thank you again for that. And I mean, just for listeners who, want to keep up with the work that you do, where can they find you?
Yeah, sure thing. I'm pretty active on what social media do I use? I have a LinkedIn, right? It's just my name, just Jeremy Orr, right? Pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. Same with Instagram, right? I share a bit about my work on there. Same, right? Just Jeremy Orr, findable, and you can definitely check out our Earth Justice, website as well to follow that account and see the work that we're doing there and stay in touch with the movement and the work and things of that sort. So
Thank you so much for that. And yeah, I learned so much from this conversation.
yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for having me on for a conversation and thanks so much for the work that you do, right? I think one of the major things, as kind of mentioned a few minutes ago, right? Just the way we talk about climate and environment, we're at a point in time where we didn't talk about it like that before, right? And it's because of people like you, right, who are lifting up these stories, who are um educating, right, people within your age range, right, within your generation. That stuff is so important. So thanks for having me, and thank you for the work that you do.
It means a lot. Thank you.